Under the burning sun of the Wild West, a lonely rancher stood by the dusty road, waiting for the woman who might finally end his years of silence. But when the wagon stopped and the figure stepped down, every man in town gasped. This was not the woman he imagined. In the year 1874, in the rough heart of Dodge City, Kansas Territory, there lived a rancher named John, a man in his 40s whose life had been carved by silence, dust, and the endless work of cattle. He was strong in body but weary in soul, for though his ranch stretched wide under the blazing sun, his nights were empty, filled only with the creak of old wood and the howl of prairie winds. Years of loneliness had carved lines on his face, and though he never spoke of it, the longing for a wife grew heavier with each season. With no time to search, he sent his hope westward in a simple letter, answering a mail-order bride advertisement. Now, as the day of her arrival drew near, whispers filled the saloons and streets, for the town was eager to see the woman who might finally break the rancher's solitude. The wagon rolled into town, wheels squeaking, dust rising in the golden light of late afternoon, and every eye followed its slow crawl down the main street, where boots tapped nervously on wooden porches and whispers carried like wind across the saloon doors. While John stood tall at the edge of the crowd, his rough hands gripping his worn hat so tight his knuckles whitened, his chest filled with a strange mix of fear and hope, and as the horses stopped with a jolt, the driver shouted something no one really heard because all eyes were fixed on the figure inside. And when she stepped down, the dust seemed to pause in the air, revealing a woman almost twice his size, broad-shouldered with fierce eyes that scanned the crowd as if she had seen them all before, her heavy boots striking the ground with confidence, her dress plain but her presence so commanding that the men nearby muttered under their breath while the women leaned closer to each other, some hiding nervous smiles, others biting their lips, and John felt his heart thud harder as his mind scrambled to match this towering stranger with the gentle words he had read in the letters he kept folded in his pocket. But before doubt could form, she looked directly at him, her gaze sharp and unflinching, locking onto his face as if she already knew his soul. And though the crowd's whispers grew louder around them, some laughing, some gasping, some pitying, John could not move, for his legs felt rooted to the ground and his throat dry, and in that heavy silence stretching between them, there was something unspoken, something far stronger than surprise, something that made the rancher's chest ache in a way he had never felt before, yet at the same time a cold shiver ran through him, because behind those fierce eyes there was a storm, and as she took one slow step closer, raising her chin as though daring the whole town to question her, John realized this was no ordinary woman, and whatever life he had expected when he sent that letter was gone forever, for destiny had brought him someone he did not understand, someone the town could never forget, and someone who carried secrets that even he might not survive to hear. Margaret's boots struck the wooden boards with weight as she closed the distance, her shadow stretching long against the fading sun, and before John could gather the courage to speak, she placed a folded paper in his hand, her voice firm yet calm as she said her name with an authority that silenced even the boldest whispers around them. And when his eyes dropped to the letter, his heart twisted because the handwriting was the same delicate script he had read over and over in his lonely nights, proving beyond doubt that she was indeed the one who had written him, though the figure standing before him was nothing like the picture his imagination had drawn, and the crowd pressed closer, as if waiting for him to protest. But John only swallowed hard, fighting a storm of disappointment tangled with a strange pull of curiosity. For though he felt cheated by the contrast between her words and her form, there was something unshakable in her gaze that made him hesitate, something unbreakable that forced him to see beyond her size and into a fire he could not explain. And when the murmurs of laughter began to rise from the men leaning against the saloon rail, Margaret did not flinch. Instead, she stepped even closer to John and lowered her voice until only he could hear, whispering words that froze his breath where he stood, words that did not match the hopeful letters but carried the weight of a secret far heavier than he had ever expected. For she leaned in with eyes burning into his and said softly, almost like a warning, "You need me more than you know." And in that instant the air around them grew heavier. The crowd seemed distant, and John's heart raced not with the joy of a man finally meeting his bride, but with the uneasy awareness that this woman had walked into his life carrying shadows of her own, shadows that could either save him or destroy everything he thought he understood. From the moment Margaret stepped onto the ranch, she moved with a force that unsettled the quiet rhythm John had known for years. Her hands never idle, her strength greater than any ranch hand he had ever hired, lifting hay bales with ease, mending broken fences before dawn, and commanding the kitchen with the authority of someone who had long ago learned to survive without waiting for help. And slowly the ranch itself began to change. Fields looked fuller, cattle grew healthier, and even the air seemed to carry a new pulse, as if her presence had breathed life into soil that had been tired of silence. Yet while John watched, he felt a war inside him, pride rising every time he saw her work, but doubt creeping in whenever her eyes carried that sharpness, that watchfulness that suggested she was not merely building a home, but preparing for something he could not yet name. And though the townsfolk began to murmur differently, some with respect, others with fear, John kept his thoughts buried behind quiet stares, until one restless night when the moon was high and the wind moved restless across the hills, he woke to the sound of boots on gravel outside the cabin, and stepping softly to the doorway, he froze at the sight of Margaret standing firm in the cold, her frame outlined against the silver light, a rifle steady in her hands, her gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the fields as if she was waiting for shadows to crawl from the hills. And in that silent moment, John's chest tightened with a question he dared not voice, for he knew this was no simple watch for coyotes or strays, but the deliberate vigilance of someone who expected an enemy. And as the night deepened, he stood there unseen, realizing his life with Margaret was not the life he had planned, but something far larger, far more dangerous. And though fear pressed hard against him, he could not look away because whatever she was waiting for was coming closer with every passing hour. The night air was sharp against John's skin as he finally stepped forward, his boots crunching softly on the gravel, and Margaret did not turn when he approached but spoke low and steady as if she had been rehearsing the truth in her mind for years, telling him she was not only his bride by letter but a woman on the run, hiding from men who once owned the saloon where she worked, men who treated her like property until one night she took the wages they had denied her for half a lifetime and walked away without looking back. And though she knew they would not forgive, she refused to return what she had rightfully earned, her voice steady but her hands tightening on the rifle as she admitted they wanted revenge and would not stop until they found her. And John felt his stomach tighten because the calm he had mistaken for strength was in fact the calm of someone who lived daily in the shadow of pursuit. And before he could speak her name, she lifted her chin toward the horizon where the hills rolled dark under the moon, and there in the silver light, he followed her gaze and saw them. Riders, slow at first, their silhouettes cutting through the night sky, their numbers unclear, but their intent certain, and the sound of hooves reached faintly across the fields, a dull thunder rolling closer with every heartbeat, and John's breath caught in his throat as Margaret whispered without flinching that this was the night she had been expecting, the night when her past would ride into their lives and demand payment. And though fear crawled through his chest, he could not look away, because he understood with sudden clarity that these men were not just coming for her, but for everything he had built. And as the wind whipped through the grass and the cattle stirred uneasily in the distance, the ranch that had once stood as his lonely fortress was about to become a battleground. And the woman he had doubted was the only one standing ready at his side, waiting for the fight that neither of them could avoid. And in that haunting silence between the echo of hooves and the tightening of his grip on the rifle, Margaret pressed into his hand. John realized the life he had imagined had ended the moment she stepped off the wagon, for now under the pale glow of the moon, the riders were coming, and nothing would ever be the same again. The riders came fast, their horses tearing through the night like shadows of vengeance, and before John could even raise his breath, the crack of gunfire shattered the silence, windows splintered, and the ranch that had once stood as his sanctuary shook under the storm of bullets. Yet Margaret did not flinch. She stepped forward with the rifle tight in her arms and fired into the dark with a steadiness that silenced even the boldest attacker, her figure lit by the muzzle flash as if she had been born for the fight. And John, driven by a fire he had never known, moved beside her, his quiet strength now a wall of defiance, loading and firing with a rhythm that matched her fearless power. And together they became something the gang had never expected. Not a frightened rancher and a runaway woman, but a force bound by survival and courage, their shouts and gunfire blending with the thunder of hooves as enemies fell one by one into the dust, the cattle scattering in panic while the barn caught sparks from stray shots. And the smoke of battle hung heavy in the night air, choking every breath. Yet neither John nor Margaret backed down. Each step they took forward felt like a vow to never surrender their land or their lives. And as the clash reached its peak, Men who had once ruled saloons and dark alleys now found themselves overpowered on open ground by two figures who refused to bend. Until at last the gunfire slowed, the shouting faded, and silence crawled back into the night, broken only by the groans of the wounded. And when the smoke cleared across the broken fences and scattered shells, the townsfolk who had crept close enough to witness gasped at the sight, for only one of the riders still moved, crawling on his hands through the dirt, bloodied but alive, dragging himself away from the ruin of his gang. And Margaret lowered her rifle while John's chest heaved with the weight of everything they had endured, and the survivor, broken yet breathing, looked back with terror in his eyes before he staggered to his horse, clutching the reins with trembling hands, and with his last strength he rode into the darkness, carrying not victory but a warning, a message etched into his fear, that the rancher and the woman who stood beside him were no longer prey, but a fire no man should dare to touch again. The ranch that once echoed with silence now breathed with strength, its fences mended, its fields alive, its nights no longer haunted by loneliness, but guarded by the bond of two souls who had fought for it together. And Margaret, once mocked for her size and feared for her defiance, now walked through Dodge City with respect in every glance, the townsfolk whispering not of doubt, but of gratitude, for she had shown them courage they themselves had lacked, while John, once a shadow of solitude, found his days filled with purpose beyond cattle and land, for he had not gained the bride of his dreams, but the partner of his destiny, and the sight of them side by side became a legend whispered in saloons and sung around campfires. And from that day forward no one called him the loner rancher. They called them both the Iron Couple of Dodge City, a name carved not from romance, but from resilience, from two hearts that chose to stand unbroken when the world tried to bend them. And perhaps that is the truth of the West, that strength is not in what you imagine, but in what stands with you when the dust rises. So tell me, do you believe true strength comes from love or from survival? Share your thoughts below. And if stories like this move you, keep riding with us, like, share, and subscribe. And don't miss more journeys across the frontier at Western Stories.